November 12, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of a makeshift prisoner of war facility nestled in the Colorado highlands, carrying cargo that would challenge everything the American military thought they knew about wartime captivity. Inside sat 43 Japanese women, members of the Women's Auxiliary Defense Corps, captured during the final American push through the Pacific Islands. They were the first and only group of Japanese female prisoners to be held on American soil, and nobody quite knew what to do with them. 24-year-old Mariko Okada sat near the back of the truck, her spine straight, despite the hours of travel, her hands folded precisely in her lap. She had been a radio operator on Saipan, intercepting American transmissions and relaying tactical information until the moment American Marines stormed her communications bunker. The memory of that day still burned behind her eyes. The explosions, the screaming, the sudden realization that everything she had been told about dying with honor was easier to believe when death wasn't actually staring you in the face. Beside her sat Hana Yoshida, a young nurse whose gentle hands had tried to save countless wounded soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific. Her dark eyes were ringed with exhaustion, and she clutched a small cloth bundle that contained the only possessions she had left. A photograph of her family in Kyoto, a wooden comb her mother had given her, and a folded paper crane she had made from a scrap of American newspaper during the long ship journey across the ocean. Teruko Watanabe, 26 years old and the oldest among them, maintained the bearing of the administrative officer she had been. Even in captivity, even wearing the rough cotton uniform the Americans had issued them, to replace their tattered military clothing, she carried herself with rigid dignity. She had been taught that capture was the ultimate shame, that death was preferable to the dishonor of enemy imprisonment. Yet here she sat, alive and ashamed, trying to convince herself that survival was not the same as cowardice. The youngest 19-year-old Fumiko Takahashi kept her eyes fixed on the floor of the truck. She had been a communications specialist, fluent in English from her years at a missionary school in Tokyo before the war. That education now felt like a curse. She understood every word the American guards spoke, heard the uncertainty in their voices as they discussed how to handle their unusual prisoners. Some voices carried pity, others carried suspicion. None carried the hatred and cruelty she had been promised would greet her in enemy captivity. The truck jerked to a stop. Through the canvas covering, Mariko could see the shadows of armed guards taking positions around the vehicle. This was it, the moment they had all been dreading since their capture. They had been told stories of American savagery, of prisoners tortured and humiliated, of women treated with unspeakable cruelty. Every breath Mariko took felt like it might be measured in her final moments of dignity. The canvas flap opened, revealing the face of Lieutenant Marguerite Caldwell. Lieutenant Marguerite Caldwell had commanded supply operations in North Africa before being reassigned to this remote Colorado facility. She had expected to oversee male prisoners, German or Italian perhaps, men whose cultural code she had at least read about in military briefings. Instead, she found herself responsible for 43 Japanese women whose language she didn't speak, whose customs she didn't understand, and whose presence in her camp created bureaucratic confusion all the way up to Washington. The military manuals had no protocols for this situation. The women descended from the truck with careful precision, each movement controlled and deliberate. Caldwell noticed how they avoided eye contact, how their faces remained expressionless masks, how even the youngest among them carried herself with the rigid formality of a soldier on parade. They lined up in perfect formation without being told, their spacing exact, their posture military despite the evident exhaustion in their faces. Mariko stood at attention, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the lieutenant's shoulder. She could feel the weight of her companion's fear pressing against her like a physical force. Hana's breathing had become shallow and quick. Teruko's jaw was clenched so tightly that Mariko could see the muscle twitching beneath her skin. Fumiko, who understood every English word being spoken around them, had gone pale as snow. The camp itself was smaller than the massive facilities that housed thousands of German and Italian prisoners across the American heartland. A cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at each corner, a central mess hall, and administrative buildings that looked hastily constructed. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with early winter snow. It was nothing like the tropical islands where most of these women had served, nothing like the crowded cities of Japan they called home. Corporal Lucia Sandoval stood nearby, clipboard in hand, trying to match faces to the names on her roster. She was one of the few female personnel at the facility, a Mexican-American woman from New Mexico who had joined the Women's Army Corps, hoping to serve her country in meaningful ways. Instead, she found herself assigned to guard duty over women who looked just as lost and frightened as she sometimes felt in the male-dominated military structure. Private Chester Harding, a farm boy from Minnesota, barely 20 years old, watched from his post near the gate. He had never seen a Japanese person before arriving at this camp. Everything he knew about them came from newsreels and propaganda posters that painted them as fanatical enemies, fundamentally different from Americans, incapable of reason or mercy. But looking at these exhausted women standing in the cold November wind, he found those images hard to reconcile with reality. They just looked tired and scared. The first days established a pattern that would define the initial weeks of captivity. The women moved through their assigned routines with mechanical precision. They woke before dawn, made their bunks with military exactness, formed perfect lines for meals, and spoke only in hushed Japanese among themselves. When American guards addressed them, they responded with silence or single-word answers delivered in barely audible voices. Mariko appointed herself unofficial leader, not through any formal declaration, but through the quiet assumption of responsibility. 3 weeks into their imprisonment, the routine had calcified into something almost comfortable in its predictability. The Japanese women had learned to navigate the strange rhythms of American military life, to anticipate the schedule of meals and roll calls, to identify which guards were merely doing their duty and which ones watched them with lingering suspicion. They existed in a state of careful invisibility, trying not to draw attention, trying not to give their captors any reason to remember the propaganda about Japanese cruelty and fanaticism. Mariko had begun keeping a small diary, writing in careful Japanese characters on scraps of paper that Corporal Sandoval had quietly provided after noticing her watching the guards fill out their reports. The corporal had said nothing, simply left a small notebook and pencil on Mariko's bunk one evening. That small gesture of unexpected kindness had shaken something loose in Mariko's carefully constructed emotional walls. But she had buried the feeling quickly. Kindness could be a trap. Trust could be a weapon. She had been taught these lessons well. On the morning of December 7, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Caldwell called an unusual assembly in the mess hall. The timing felt ominous. Mariko felt her stomach tighten as the women filed into the large wooden building, the cold morning air following them inside. Hannah's hand found hers briefly. A fleeting touch of solidarity before military discipline reasserted itself, and they stood at attention, waiting. Caldwell stood at the front of the hall, and beside her was a man the women had seen only briefly before. Sergeant Salvatore Fontana, the camp's head cook, a broad-shouldered Italian-American from Brooklyn, with hands the size of dinner plates and a face that looked like it had seen more than its share of hard living. He wore his uniform with the casual comfort of a man more at home in a kitchen than on a parade ground. Behind them, several guards were wheeling in covered serving carts, the metal lids concealing whatever lay beneath. The lieutenant cleared her throat and began speaking in her clear, measured voice. Fumiko translated quietly for those who couldn't follow the English, her whispered words rippling through the formation like water through reeds. "Ladies, we recognize that your situation here is difficult. You are far from home, uncertain about your future, and surrounded by people you were taught to consider enemies. We cannot change those facts, but what we can do is show you that despite the war between our nations, we still recognize your humanity. Mariko's translation skills were good enough to follow most of the speech, but she found herself focused more on the lieutenant's face than her words. There was no mockery there, no cruelty, just a kind of tired sincerity that seemed genuine. But Mariko had learned not to trust appearances. Sincerity could be performed, kindness could be calculated. She forced her expression to remain neutral even as her mind raced through possibilities, trying to anticipate what was coming. Sergeant Fontana stepped forward then, his accent thick and unmistakably New York. "My nonna, my grandmother, she always said that you can't hate someone once you've broken bread with them. So tonight, we're doing something special. Tonight, we're having Italian spaghetti night." He gestured to the covered carts with obvious pride. The words hung in the air like a puzzle with missing pieces. Italian spaghetti night. Fumiko translated the phrase carefully, but the confusion only deepened. Most of the women had never heard of spaghetti. Italy was Germany's ally, an Axis power like Japan. Yet here was an Italian-American sergeant talking about sharing Italian food with Japanese prisoners. The logic escaped them entirely. Was this some kind of test? A humiliation ritual disguised as generosity? Teruko leaned slightly toward Mariko and whispered in rapid Japanese, "What is spaghetti? Is it a weapon? A punishment?" Her voice carried the edge of genuine fear. 3 years of war had taught them that nothing from the enemy came without strings attached. Mariko could only shake her head slightly, equally baffled, her mind trying to reconcile the sergeant's warm smile with the possibility of some cruel deception. Sergeant Fontana began lifting the metal lids from the serving carts, and the mess hall filled with a smell unlike anything the Japanese women had experienced before. Rich tomato sauce, garlic, basil, oregano, the sharp tang of Parmesan cheese. The scent was overwhelming, aggressive in its intensity, nothing like the delicate flavors of miso and rice and fish that had defined their culinary world. Several women visibly recoiled, their noses wrinkling at the unfamiliar assault on their senses, but it was what lay beneath those lids that truly shattered their composure. Plate after plate after plate of spaghetti, each portion enormous by any standard, but absolutely staggering. To women who had been on military rations for years, mountains of golden pasta topped with crimson sauce, steam rising from each plate like offerings at a shrine. There had to be at least 60 plates lined up on those carts, and more were being brought in from the kitchen by Private Harding and other guards who wore expressions of careful neutrality. Mariko felt something break inside her chest. It wasn't the kindness of the gesture that undid her, though that was part of it. It was the sheer abundance. The impossible, incomprehensible, almost obscene abundance of food being presented to them. During her final months on Saipan, she had watched soldiers subsist on handfuls of rice and whatever they could forage from the jungle. She had gone to sleep hungry more nights than she could count. And here, in enemy captivity, she was being presented with more food than she had seen in months. Hana's breath caught audibly beside her. The young nurse's eyes had gone wide, and her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Mariko knew what she was thinking because she was thinking it too. This had to be poisoned. Why else would the Americans waste such abundance on prisoners? Why else would they smile while serving it? The propaganda had been clear. Americans were brutal, wasteful, decadent. They would torture prisoners for sport, starve them for pleasure, humiliate them before killing them. Fumiko's translation had stopped entirely. She stood frozen, staring at the plates with an expression that mixed hunger, suspicion, and something that might have been grief. She had eaten American food before the war, had attended enough missionary social events to recognize pasta, but she had never seen it served like this, never in such quantities, never offered with such apparent goodwill to people who were supposed to be hated enemies. Lieutenant Caldwell gestured toward the serving line. The invitation to approach the serving line landed like a stone in still water. Nobody moved. 43 Japanese women stood frozen in formation, staring at the mountains of food, with expressions that ranged from longing to terror. The silence stretched so long that Sergeant Fontana's smile began to falter, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. He looked to Lieutenant Caldwell, who maintained her calm expression, but Mariko could see the tension in her shoulders. This moment mattered somehow, though Mariko couldn't quite understand why the Americans seemed so invested in whether or not they ate. Private Harding stepped forward, picked up one of the plates, and took a deliberate bite of spaghetti in full view of the assembled prisoners. He chewed, swallowed, smiled, and set the plate back down. The message was clear: not poisoned, safe. But trust was not so easily earned, and the women remained motionless, locked in their disciplined formation, as if movement itself might trigger some terrible consequence. It was Hana who finally broke the stalemate. The young nurse had been staring at the food with an intensity that bordered on pain, and Mariko realized with a sudden clarity that Hana was starving. They all were really, but Hana had always been slight, and the military rations they'd been receiving were barely enough to sustain her small frame. Mariko watched as Hana's resolve crumbled, as hunger overcame fear, as she took one trembling step forward and then another. Hana's hands shook as she accepted a plate from Sergeant Fontana. He said something in English, his voice gentle, and though Hana couldn't understand the words, she recognized kindness in his tone. She carried the plate back to where the women stood, and everyone watched as she lifted the fork. The implement felt wrong in her hand, too large, too heavy, designed for a way of eating that her muscle memory didn't recognize. She tried to spear a strand of pasta the way she might use chopsticks, but the slippery noodles refused to cooperate. Fumiko whispered quick instructions in Japanese, drawing on her missionary school memories of Western table manners. Hana adjusted her grip, managed to capture a small portion of spaghetti and sauce, and brought it to her lips. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Then Hana's eyes went wide, not with pain or disgust, but with something that looked almost like wonder. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and for the first time since their capture, a genuine smile crossed her face. That smile broke the dam. Taruko moved forward next, her military bearing cracking as hunger and curiosity overpowered discipline. Then Fumiko, then others, until a line had formed, and women were accepting plates with shaking hands and expressions of disbelief. Mariko found herself swept along in the movement, unable to resist the pull of communal action, even as her mind screamed warnings about trust and deception and the dangers of letting your guard down. When Sergeant Fontana handed her a plate, he met her eyes directly and said something in English. Fumiko, standing nearby with her own plate, translated softly. He says his grandmother would be happy to know her recipe is feeding people who need it. Mariko didn't know what to do with that information, didn't know how to process the idea that somewhere in America there was an old Italian woman whose cooking traditions were now being shared with Japanese prisoners of war. The first bite was a revelation. The mess hall transformed from a place of rigid military discipline into something that resembled chaos, though a strangely gentle chaos. 43 Japanese women sat at long wooden tables, each wrestling with plates of spaghetti and the completely foreign challenge of eating with forks. Noodles slipped off tines, sauce splattered on uniform fronts, and the careful dignity that had defined these women since their arrival began to crack under the sheer absurdity of the struggle. Mariko watched Taruko attempt to twirl spaghetti the way she had seen Fumiko demonstrate, only to have the entire portion slide off her fork and land back on the plate with a soft splat. The older woman's face flushed with embarrassment, and she looked around quickly to see if anyone had noticed her failure. But when she glanced at the next table, she saw 3 other women experiencing the exact same problem. And despite herself, despite everything she had been taught about maintaining composure, Taruko laughed. It was a small sound, quickly stifled, but it was genuine. Private Harding had been watching the women's struggles with growing concern. He approached Mariko's table slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to startle a wild animal. He held his own fork and demonstrated the twirling motion, rotating his wrist to wrap the pasta around the tines. Mariko watched his movements carefully, trying to memorize the angle, the pressure, the way he used the edge of the plate as leverage. When she attempted to replicate it, her first try was clumsy, but her second was better. Harding smiled and gave her a thumbs up, a gesture that needed no translation. Then he moved to the next table where Hannah sat looking completely defeated by her plate of pasta. The young nurse had given up on the fork entirely and was staring at the food with an expression of frustrated hunger. Harding pulled up a chair, sat down beside her, and began demonstrating again, his movements slow and exaggerated so she could follow each step. Corporal Lucius Sandoval joined the effort, moving between tables and offering quiet encouragement in English that most of the women couldn't understand but appreciated nonetheless. She had a natural warmth that transcended language barriers, and when she demonstrated the fork twirling technique, she did it with theatrical flair that made several women smile despite their confusion. At one table, she noticed a woman trying to eat the spaghetti by lifting individual strands with her fingers, and rather than correct her, Sandoval simply showed her a gentler approach with the fork. Sergeant Fontana emerged from the kitchen carrying more plates, his face beaming with satisfaction as he surveyed the scene. He had cooked for soldiers across 2 continents, had fed hungry men in North Africa and Italy, and now in the mountains of Colorado. But he had never seen people approach his food with quite this combination of suspicion, wonder, and desperate hunger. When he set down a fresh plate for a latecomer, he noticed tomato sauce on the woman's cheek and, without thinking, handed her a napkin with a gentle gesture toward her face. Fumiko found herself in the unlikely role of cultural ambassador, moving between tables to translate questions and instructions. One woman wanted to know what the red sauce was made from. Another asked if this was what all Americans ate every day. A third wanted to know if it was disrespectful to their captors if they couldn't master the fork technique quickly enough. Fumiko answered what she could, inventing answers when she didn't know, trying to bridge the vast cultural canyon that separated these 2 groups. That night, after the mess hall had been cleared and the women had returned to their barracks, Mariko sat on her narrow bunk with the small notebook Corporal Sandoval had given her. The overhead lights had been dimmed for evening hours, but she could still see well enough to write by the glow from the guard tower searchlights that swept periodically across the compound. Around her, other women prepared for sleep, their movements slower than usual, weighted down by full stomachs and the confusion of what they had experienced. Mariko's pen hovered over the blank page. She wanted to write to her mother in Osaka, to her younger sister, who had been only 15 when Mariko left for military service, to her father, who had stood so proudly when she enlisted. But the International Red Cross mail system was unreliable at best, and she had no way of knowing if her family had survived the American bombing campaigns that were reducing Japanese cities to ash. More than that, she didn't know how to explain what had happened tonight in words that wouldn't sound like collaboration or weakness. She began writing anyway, knowing the letter would likely never be sent, but needing to process her thoughts somewhere outside her own mind. "Dear Mother," she wrote, in careful Japanese characters, "tonight the Americans fed us a meal from Italy. They gave us more food than I have seen since before the war." They smiled while serving it. "They taught us how to eat it with patience and kindness. I do not understand what is happening to me. I was taught that Americans were demons who delighted in cruelty. But tonight I saw no demons, only tired soldiers trying to share something good." 3 bunks away, Hannah was writing her own letter, though hers took the form of a prayer rather than correspondence. She had been raised in a Buddhist household, but the missionary nurses she had trained with had exposed her to Christian practices, and now she found herself drawing on both traditions as she tried to make sense of her confusion. "I thought I would die with honor," she wrote. "I thought capture meant torture and degradation. Instead, I am warm, fed, and treated with a gentleness I did not expect. How do I reconcile the teachings of my youth with the reality of my present?" Teruko's approach was more analytical, more military in its structure. She cataloged the day's events with the precision of an intelligence report, noting the approximate portions of food served, the behavior of individual guards, the emotional responses of her fellow prisoners. But beneath the clinical language, questions bled through. "Strategic purpose unclear," she wrote. "Americans expending significant resources on prisoner comfort. Possible explanations: psychological warfare, attempt to extract information through kindness, genuine adherence to Geneva Convention protocols, or simple human decency that contradicts all propaganda we received." Fumiko wrote nothing. She sat on her bunk with paper and pencil in hand, but the words wouldn't come. Her missionary school education had already taught her that Americans were not monsters. But she had convinced herself that wartime would bring out the worst in everyone. Tonight had shaken that assumption. Private Harding's patient demonstration reminded her of her English teacher, who had shown the same gentle persistence when teaching difficult vocabulary words. The spaghetti dinner became a turning point that neither the prisoners nor their captors fully recognized in the moment. In the days that followed, the rigid walls of mutual suspicion began developing hairline cracks. Small gestures multiplied. Corporal Sandoval brought extra blankets when the December cold intensified. Private Harding shared photographs of his family farm in Minnesota, pointing to pictures of his sister and saying her name slowly so the women could practice English pronunciation. Sergeant Fontana continued his culinary diplomacy, introducing the prisoners to American pancakes, then pot roast, each meal another brick removed from the wall of hatred. But it was the arrival of newspapers in late December that truly shattered the foundations of everything the Japanese women had believed about their war. Lieutenant Caldwell had debated whether to allow the prisoners access to American news, knowing it would contain information that contradicted Japanese propaganda. She finally decided that truth, however painful, was preferable to allowing them to remain trapped in comfortable lies. Fumiko was the first to read the articles, her English fluent enough to understand the detailed reports coming from the Pacific Theater. She sat in the small camp library, a newspaper spread before her, reading accounts of Japanese military atrocities in China, the Philippines, throughout Southeast Asia. The rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, medical experiments on prisoners, forced labor camps, comfort women. Each revelation hit her like a physical blow, and her hands began to tremble so violently that the newspaper rustled audibly. Mariko found her there, tears streaming down Fumiko's face as she stared at photographs that accompanied the articles. Images of emaciated Allied prisoners, of civilians who had suffered under Japanese occupation, of destruction that couldn't be blamed on American aggression because it had happened in territories Japan had invaded. Fumiko looked up at Mariko with eyes that reflected complete devastation. "They told us we were liberating Asia from Western colonialism," she whispered in Japanese. "They told us we were defending our homeland, but this is not defense. This is not liberation." Mariko took the newspaper with shaking hands and began to read. With each paragraph, her understanding of her own identity shifted and cracked. She had believed she was serving a righteous cause, that Japan's military expansion was justified by centuries of Western exploitation of Asian peoples. She had convinced herself that any suffering caused by Japanese forces was unfortunate but necessary, the regrettable cost of creating a Greater East Asia, co-prosperity sphere. But the evidence before her told a different story, one of systematic cruelty that went far beyond military necessity. Other women gathered around as word spread through the barracks. Hana read about the treatment of nurses who had been captured by Japanese forces, women like herself who had been subjected to horrors she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. Teruko discovered accounts of military commanders she had served under, men she had respected, now described as war criminals responsible for atrocities. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, the gap between propaganda and reality too vast to bridge with comfortable rationalizations. Spring came to the Colorado mountains in 1945 with a beauty that felt almost cruel in its indifference to human suffering. Snow melted from the peaks, wildflowers began pushing through the earth, and news arrived that the war in Europe had ended with Germany's surrender. For the Japanese women prisoners, the changing season brought not hope, but profound anxiety. The war in the Pacific continued, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before Japan faced the same fate as Germany. Lieutenant Caldwell received orders in early August regarding the eventual repatriation of Japanese prisoners. The process would begin once hostilities ceased, with all prisoners of war to be returned to their homeland according to Geneva Convention protocols. She called the women together on August 10th, the day after news broke about a devastating new weapon used on Nagasaki following a similar attack on Hiroshima days earlier. The lieutenant's face was grave as she explained that Japan had announced its intention to surrender. The women received the news in stunned silence. Victory had always seemed inevitable when they served the emperor. Defeat was not a concept their training had prepared them for, but more than the shock of surrender, they faced a more immediate and personal crisis. What did they have to return to? Reports filtering through Red Cross channels painted a picture of complete devastation. Cities in ruins, families scattered or dead, a society that would view returning female prisoners as shameful failures who had dishonored themselves and their families through capture. Mariko had finally received word about her family through the Red Cross. Her father had died in an air raid. Her mother and sister's whereabouts were unknown. The house where she had grown up no longer existed, reduced to rubble in the firebombing of Osaka. She had nothing to return to except ashes and the judgment of a society that would see her survival in enemy captivity as worse than honorable death. In the mess hall that had witnessed their transformation, the women gathered for what everyone assumed would be their final weeks together. But Hana stood up, her voice stronger than Mariko had ever heard it. Speaking in careful English so Lieutenant Caldwell could understand, she said words that would change everything. "Lieutenant, some of us wish to discuss possibility of staying in America." The request sent shockwaves through both the prisoners and the American personnel. Corporal Sandoval looked stunned. Private Harding's mouth fell open. Sergeant Fontana stopped mid-stride, a serving spoon frozen in his hand. Even Lieutenant Caldwell, who prided herself on maintaining composure in any situation, visibly struggled to process what she had just heard. Mariko stood next to Hana, followed by Fumiko, then Teruko, then 9 others. 13 women total standing together in silent declaration that they would rather remain with former enemies than return to a homeland that no longer felt like home. They had found something in this Colorado prison camp that Japan could no longer offer them. Not just safety or abundance, but the possibility of becoming something other than what their past had made them. The possibility of redemption through choice rather than obligation. 20 years after that August morning when 13 Japanese women stood and requested to remain in American captivity, Mariko Okada Pemberton sat in her kitchen in Denver, Colorado, preparing spaghetti for her family. Her husband Thomas, a veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater, sat at the table reading the newspaper. Their 2 children, 15-year-old Margaret and 12-year-old James, were doing homework nearby. The scene was so thoroughly American, so completely ordinary, that sometimes Mariko had to pause and remember the journey that had brought her here. The process of staying had been complicated, requiring special dispensation from the War Department and individual sponsors willing to vouch for former enemy nationals. Mrs. Constance Pemberton, a local teacher who had volunteered at the camp, had offered to sponsor Mariko. That sponsorship had eventually led to meeting Thomas, Mrs. Pemberton's nephew, who had returned from the war carrying his own complicated feelings about the enemy he had fought. Their courtship had been a delicate dance of shared trauma and mutual understanding, two people trying to build something new from the ruins of a terrible conflict. Hana had become Dr. Hana Yoshida, completing medical school and now running a clinic in San Francisco that served immigrant communities. She never married, dedicating her life instead to healing as a form of living amends for the suffering caused by the country she had once served. She and Mariko corresponded regularly, their letters filled with reflections on how far they had traveled from that November day when they first arrived in Colorado, terrified and convinced they faced torture and death. Fumiko had returned to teaching, working with Japanese-American students whose families had been interned during the war. She found a strange kinship with these children, all of them caught between two identities, all of them trying to reconcile conflicting loyalties and the pain of being seen as enemy. Aliens in the only country many of them had ever known. Her fluency in both languages and cultures made her invaluable as a bridge between communities trying to heal. Taruko had taken a different path. After 2 years in America, she chose to return to Japan as part of a cultural exchange program, carrying with her the lessons of reconciliation she had learned. She wrote to Mariko about the difficulty of that choice, about facing the judgment of a society that viewed her American years with deep suspicion, but also about the importance of bringing back proof that former enemies could become friends, that forgiveness was possible even after terrible conflict. The other women who had stayed found their own paths to belonging. Some married, some pursued careers, some struggled with the weight of dual identity and the constant navigation between two cultures. But all of them carried the memory of that spaghetti dinner as a turning point, the moment when they first glimpsed the possibility that people were not defined solely by the nations they served or the wars they fought. Mariko's children knew their mother's story, had heard about the prison camp and the choice she made. They asked questions that she answered honestly, never hiding the complexity of her past or the genuine crimes committed by the country she had once proudly served.